Would you please turn to Matthew chapter 5? You'll find that on page 969. If you're using a church Bible, Matthew 5, page 969. And I'm going to read, I'm going to begin by reading verses 1 and 2, just to remind us of what's going on here. And then I'm going to move down to verse 31 and read through to 37. So Matthew 5, 1 to 2, and then moving to verse 31. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. Verse 31, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said that to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the oaths you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please do keep those verses open in front of you. Have you ever had a child come to you, or maybe you as a child said this to your parents, but you said? Now, sometimes we didn't say, but you said we could watch TV as soon as we got home. No. I said we could watch TV when we got home. The list of pre-TV jobs is always in force. There's always the temptation for us, isn't there, to add to what someone said or take it away so it benefits us a little bit better. Maybe that's partly why God made sure his word was written down so we couldn't say, oh, but you said. But sometimes we did say. I don't know about you, I often agree to things when I'm not paying attention, particularly with my children. Yes. And then a little bit later, when I say, no, we're going to do this, and they say, but you said, and they're right, I did. And then I've got a choice. Am I going to explain it away? Am I going to manipulate things so that I don't do what I said? Or am I going to say, yeah, you're right, I did say it, so we better do it? And in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has been showing us, hasn't he, how what was being taught about God's law was not faithful to what God's law actually said. So he keeps using this phrase, you have heard it said. But then as the king with authority over God's kingdom, as the one who perfectly fulfills the law, he explains the true meaning of God's law when he says, but I say to you, so and so. And in the section we're looking at this morning, Jesus shows us that includes the things that we say as well. The promises and commitments we make. And as we've been making our way through the Sermon on the Mount, there are kind of three overall things that we keep being brought back to. The first thing the Sermon on the Mount does is it makes us realize our need of God's grace. Jesus says that to enter his kingdom, we need a righteousness that will exceed the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the most right people that were around at the time. He says, your righteousness needs to exceed those. And what Jesus is doing is he's explaining to us in this sermon what this righteousness looks like. This is the righteousness you need to exceed the Pharisees and enter the kingdom of heaven. Righteousness that begins with our hearts and flows out into our actions and words and values and priorities. And as we hear what Jesus teaches, as we see what he says, we realize that even at our best, our righteousness falls way short of what God calls us to. We saw that last week, didn't we? When we were talking about anger and we were talking about lust. I don't think anybody left here having heard what Jesus says there going, yep, got that nailed down. I'm perfectly right for God. If you thought that, go back and listen to it again. We realize that our righteousness falls short, and therefore we cannot be in the kingdom of heaven. And so we realize our desperate need of God's grace. That we need the death of Christ as the one who perfectly fulfilled the law, as the one who was perfectly righteous. We need his death to take away the penalty for our sin. And we need his perfect life, his perfect righteousness to be gifted to us so that we can enter the kingdom of heaven. We see our utter need of God's grace. But second, we also see the evidence of God's grace. That the things that Jesus is describing here on the Sermon on the Mount, they're not things that we need in order to get into the kingdom of heaven. God's grace gets us into the kingdom of heaven. The righteousness of Jesus gets us into the kingdom of heaven, his life and death and resurrection. So these things are not the things we do to get into the kingdom of heaven. These are the things that we are because we are in the kingdom of heaven. You are the salt of the earth, Jesus says. You are the light of the world. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If we are in the kingdom of heaven, it's because God has done a transforming work in our hearts. He has changed them. He has given us new life. He has poured out his grace upon us so that we now have a heart that is poor in spirit, that mourns sin, that is meek and is humble and searches for righteousness and is merciful and is peacemaking and is pure. We want those things because we are those things. But it also means we need to examine ourselves. That if we aren't displaying these qualities, if the heart that the Beatitudes describes is not our heart, if we are not experiencing some measure of control over anger and lust, if we're not displaying the things that Jesus is going to show us in the coming weeks, not perfectly, not fully, I get that. We're still a work in progress. But if these things are not the posture of our hearts, then we need to honestly reflect on whether we are truly submitting to God's King and whether his love is the thing that is shaping our hearts. Whether we truly are in the kingdom. And if we are searching ourselves this morning and we realize that that is true of us, then we need to go back to the first thing. We need God's grace. We need to repent and we need to call on Jesus to forgive our sin and to transform our hearts. There is grace for us. God is highlighting to you the condition of your heart, and that is part of his grace. He's giving you the opportunity to receive his salvation, to receive the righteousness of Christ, if we will humble ourselves before him. But then the third thing we're being shown is that the evidence, as the evidence of God's grace is on display, then we are reflecting this God of grace. That we reflect his righteousness so that we draw others to him and he is given glory. That was Matthew 5:16. As we live out being the salt of the earth, as we live out being the light of the world, people will see God's righteousness on display and they will be drawn to him and they will give glory to him. And that is the truth that I think we need to keep particularly in mind as we think about the verses we're going into today. That as we are living out these things, we reflect a God who is faithful. As we are faithful to the words that we say and the promises we make, we are reflecting a God who is faithful. And the first area that Jesus highlights in this is the area of marriage. Verse 31, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, I have to tell you, I came to a decision quite late on Friday evening. I'm not going to cover both points today. The problem is we'd already sent out the slides and the sermon notes, so you know where we're going. We're just not getting there today. And the reason for that is that I came to the conclusion on Friday evening that divorce is just too big a thing to skim over. I recognize that just even that word, divorce, will create in some of us pain, some of us shame. So please bear with us as we go through this morning, because there is grace. There is grace in these words of Jesus. And if you're a single person in the room this morning, don't go, oh great, just one sermon on divorce and nothing else. That's not really for me. Yes, it is for you, because of all that marriage represents and pictures. And also because you are part of a body, a family, where you have a role in to support faithful marriages in the way that Jesus is commanding us to. So, we're going to look at marriage. Before we look at what Jesus says here, we need to understand a bit of the background. And that was what we had read to us in Matthew 19. What's going on in Jesus' time when he's speaking about divorce? Because divorce had become a topic of hot debate. We see that in Matthew 19, and it all comes from this provision within God's law, Deuteronomy 24, where God said that a man is allowed to divorce his wife if he finds something displeasing in her. And the hot debate was, what is displeasing? Basically, there are two camps, two schools of thought. The first group thought that displeasing meant sexual immorality or indecency, as it talks about in Deuteronomy 24. The second group thought displeasing could be any number of things. You might find that dress she's wearing displeasing. You might find the way she cooks the dinner displeasing. You might find her new perfume displeasing. You might find her attitude displeasing. I mean, careful, ladies. It's probably time that you go to Boots on the way home and get that new perfume, and Waterstones, you can get the next Mary Berry cookbook. Time to up your game, right? But that's not all of it. Because the Pharisees weren't just teaching that you could get a divorce. They were teaching you should get a divorce. It'd be like if one of the guys came to me this morning. I said, hey, you all right? No, I'm not all right. My wife cooked me breakfast this morning and she hard-boiled the eggs again. It's really displeasing to me, hard yolks. I like runny yolks. And my advice to them would be, well, you better go see the solicitor this week. Not you should. Not you could. You better go and see the solicitor. Now, some of you can't believing this is true, and you can't believe I've just said that from the front. And you're thinking, this is the problem with God and the Bible. It's just this kind of toxic patriarchy that demeans women. Well, hold on. Because God's provision in Deuteronomy 24 was not meant to be permission. It was meant to be protection. It was meant to be to protect women from being abandoned. If a man left his wife, in this culture, it could leave her destitute and isolated from the community. It could leave her in shame. And in the case of an illegitimate divorce, if she was then forced into the position of having to remarry, Matthew 5:32, it could actually make her and the person she marries victims of adultery. And in fact, God went even further in Deuteronomy 24. He didn't just say, if you found something displeasing, you could divorce your wife, and all you have to do is issue a certificate of divorce. God goes on to say, and that means you can't go back to her. The clause is meant to make people think twice, or 3 times, or 4 times, to really think through, should I do this or not? Because there is no going back. No, it's because God has a very high view of women that he makes this provision. It's not because he doesn't care about them. He deeply cares about them, and so he puts in a rule to protect them from the sinful tendencies of men, from mistreatment and from abandonment. protecting them from being treated as if they were just things that if they weren't useful anymore, they could just be thrown out and we'll get the newest model. But this command in God's law was not only to protect women, it was to protect the sanctity, the importance of marriage itself. God has a high view of women, and he also has a very high view of marriage. Which is why it's so sad that a rule that God had meant for protection is being twisted to make it into permission. That's how perverse the human heart is. It twists what is a good rule from God into something selfish for ourselves. And that is something we're all tempted to do, not just in our marriages. We are all tempted to twist God's word into getting permission to do the thing that we really want to do. We're always running the risk of that attitude that says, well, what am I permitted to do? How far can I go? Rather than looking at the thing and saying, what is God calling me to do here? And how can I joyfully live that out in a way that's going to bring him the most glory? It's a different heart posture. It takes us back to that song we've just sung. Lord, write your name upon our hearts. Make them good and clean and pure and faithful. God has a high view of marriage, something that Jesus then goes on to reinforce in Matthew 5. It said that anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. Do you see again, the Pharisees are all about the external. They're only concerned with the process. Did you get the paperwork right? The concern here is about right procedure, not about right reasons. External rather than internal. And again, it's easy to be self-righteous if you follow the process. Did I get the paperwork right? Did I give her a fair share in the divorce? Did we amicably sort out access to the children? Did I agree to support them well enough? Well, okay, God won't be angry then, will he? Oh, okay, so we didn't really mean what we said when we said to love and to cherish, to have and to hold, forsaking all others, to be faithful as long as we both shall live. You see, England's not so different to first century Palestine, is it? We're the land of no-fault divorce. A couple of clicks on the internet, as long as we all agree, and the certificate gets sent by email. I wonder what Jesus would think of no-fault divorce. I think he'd say something like Matthew 19, it's never no fault. It's because your hearts are hard. See, back then, in Jesus' time, you had men divorcing women without any concern for them. Or maybe you had women who were asking for a divorce, but the men didn't stop and think, why? Why are they asking for this? What have I done wrong? They were just like, okay, well, here's your certificate. Thank you very much. They didn't stop and think, am I treating my wife in such a way that I'm not showing her the love of God and now she wants to leave? See, maybe some of us here are in danger this morning of wanting to tap out of our marriages. Maybe some of us have. We haven't filed the paperwork, but emotionally we've tapped out. And whilst what Jesus says here in Matthew 5 isn't all that Jesus says about divorce, and it's not all that the Bible says about divorce, there are other circumstances where sadly it may be possible for divorce, abandonment or abuse. But it is clear from Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 that the grounds for doing so are very, very limited. Now, I can't go into the detail of all of that, but I want to plead with you this morning that if you are finding your marriage tough, please do not suffer alone. I wouldn't want anybody to go away going, right, I'm struggling in my marriage, but they've said, in this church that divorce is only acceptable in these circumstances, so I can't talk to anybody about it there. That would be the wrong thing to go away and think. Because it breaks my heart as a pastor when people come to you with troubles in their marriages, when they're at the point of destruction, when it's about to blow up, when it's all about to collapse and melt down. When they could have come way, way earlier, and it was only pride or shame that kept them from doing it. If anyone is here struggling, please do not struggle alone. Marriage can be tough. I struggle. We all struggle. We struggle because, Matthew 19, our hearts can become hard. But we also struggle because God's purpose for marriage and what marriage represents, it is so good that Satan will hit it with everything that he has possibly got. So please, speak to a brother or sister. Speak to one of the elders. Let us help you and your spouse, by God's grace, to work towards marriages that joyfully fulfill God's purposes and bring him glory. You see, whilst divorce may be permitted, it's never the norm and it's never ideal. To be married is to become a one flesh union with someone. Something that is then wonderfully pictured and enjoyed and strengthened in the physical union of sex. It's powerful, it's precious, it's pure. And I think that's why Jesus gives the exception for divorce in verse 32 of sexual immorality. Because sex outside of that one flesh union between a man and a woman is to violate and rip apart that union. And yes, that can be wonderfully repaired and restored by God's grace. You don't have to divorce as a result of it. But sometimes that damage can be so brutal that the offended person just can't trust again. And in those circumstances, they shouldn't bear any guilt for that. And it is interesting, isn't it, that Jesus seems to be mainly directing his comments to men. Have you noticed that, both in the lust and the adultery? Now, I'm not saying that means women, you've got nothing to worry about here, just switch off and you'll be all right. But Jesus does seem to draw a line, doesn't he, from lust to adultery to divorce. And maybe it is that is a line that men are more inclined to travel down. So men, let's pay attention to what Jesus is highlighting to us here. And so because marriage is this one flesh union, it should only be broken in very limited or exceptional circumstances. And when it happens, we must always acknowledge that it is a fallout from sin. It is Matthew 19, God permitted divorce because our hearts are hard. And the consequence of a divorce is it always ruptures this one flesh union. God has a high view of marriage, and so adultery and divorce are an assault on that marriage. And I suspect that most of us recognize that in some way. Some of us here this morning are suffering the pain and fallout of having been left by a husband or wife. Sometimes because they left with somebody else, sometimes just because they left. Some of us might continue to experience the feelings of pain and regret because we recognize we were the ones that were the main cause of the breakdown of our marriage. And some of us are in between. We're not sure why it broke down, but it did break down, and there was fault on both sides, and we live with the confusion and disappointment of that. Some of us are in the middle right now of a very difficult marriage, and we are thinking of calling it a day. And some of us suffer the scars of having endured a destructive marriage. And some of us the scars and ongoing difficulties of the fallout of somebody else's divorce, parents or family or close friends. And just in my relatively short time as a pastor, 7 years in, I've had to counsel several couples through marriage difficulties. Sometimes, wonderfully, that leads to those marriages being restored. Sometimes they just manage to limp on. Sometimes, sadly, they end up in divorce. And do you know, even my 9-year-old son has been impacted by this. He was talking to me the other day about his friend whose dad had an affair and left. Even he recognizes the pain that family are in, the betrayal, and it even makes him feel less secure about his own family. Please don't believe this absolute lie, this blind lie that people love to tell themselves, that a divorce somehow is good for everybody involved. It's rubbish. Pain, guilt, disappointment, weariness, scars, struggles. That's the legacy of divorce. And actually, not divorce. It's the legacy of two people not living faithfully and graciously in a marriage. Don't think if you haven't got to the point of divorce yet that you're not causing some of this. If we're refusing to live in our marriages in a faithful and gracious way. And remember, Jesus is speaking at the heart level. You might not have committed adultery with another person, but last week we can do it with a lustful look. And I look at it and I think about it and I ponder on it and I think, oh, how we need the grace of God. How my marriage, how my heart, how we all need the wonderful, amazing, comforting, healing, strengthening grace of God. The grace to forgive and the grace to transform us and others and the relationships we have, to restore us and to heal us. If you are struggling in your marriage this morning, then the best and first thing you must do is draw on the grace of God. If you've been damaged by the unfaithfulness of somebody else, draw on the grace of God. Hold on to His wonderful grace as we reflect on these things today. But also, let's just be realistic about the damage and vandalism that unfaithful and ungracious marriages cause. The assault that it is, not just to those impacted, but also to the picture that we give of God Himself. Remember these three things. We're driven to realize our need for God's grace. But also that as we live out the Sermon on the Mount, including as we live out our marriages, we are reflecting the God who is faithful. The God who always means what He says and always does what He says. We are reflecting that in our marriages. And you see that throughout the Bible. Marriage is given as a picture for us to understand who God is, for us to understand God's commitment and love for His people. So God commits Himself to His people. He pursues His people. He woos His people. He calls them. He unites Himself to them. He makes them promises to love and cherish and care for them, and forsaking all others to be with them as long as they shall live. And alongside that, you even see the sin of God's people, that they rebel against Him and they wander away and they set their love on other things. And the Bible even pictures that as adultery, as literally sin is cheating on God. But graciously, God wonderfully continues to be committed. He continues to forgive. He continues to show grace. He continues to pour out His love on us, even though we are adulterers to Him. That's the faithfulness of the God we worship. He is so committed in love to His people that He sends His Son to an adulterous people so He can call them back to Himself. The God who sends his Son to die on the cross to show his love, his commitment, his faithfulness, his grace to his bride. That's how much I love you. That's how much I'm going to forgive you. Jesus, who sacrificially gives himself in covenant love. Married or not, if you're a Christian here this morning, if you're someone who is united to Christ, that is the love God has for you. That is how committed and faithful he is to you. And that is what we have pictured for us in those faithful marriages that we have in this church. And so I'm going to ask you, I'm going to plead with you, please encourage faithful marriages. Please pray for faithful, God-reflecting marriages. I know that some of us here might be sad that we're not married, or we've never been married, or that our marriages have been ended, either through death or divorce. And I don't want to be insensitive to that, but you can still look at the marriages around you and see joy there, because you see God's love reflected to you. And hopefully, as these married families include single people into their families, and there is a challenge there for us married people to hear this morning, as we include single people in our families, then they also get to experience some of the joy of that covenant love that is a reflection of the greater love that God has for all his people. So I hope you can see why God hates divorce. Yes, it might sadly sometimes be necessary, but it always distorts his faithfulness and grace. That if we're not faithful in our marriages, what does that show to the world around us about God? What are we communicating about who God is? What are we saying about his love? What are we saying about if he can be really trusted? But on the flip side, can you see why God has such a high view of marriage? Because as we remain faithful in our marriages, as we experience and share God's grace in our marriages, it is God and it is Jesus that we have the joy of reflecting and showing to this world. Now, I'm conscious that this morning may have touched on some painful issues. And maybe it's raised lots of questions or concerns about the past or about stuff that's going on in the present. And please, can I encourage you, don't go away and just sit on that or stew on it, let it eat away at you. I repeat my earlier plea, please come and speak to me or one of the elders or a close Christian friend. But let me close with this, and maybe as I close, the musicians can make their way back up. This week, the film star Hugh Jackman, Wolverine, Greatest Showman, some of you know who I'm talking about, he announced that he is divorcing his wife after 27 years. And some people go, oh, that's a shame. But some people go, well, 27 years, I mean, that's pretty good. You know what God thinks? He thinks it's a travesty. He thinks it's tragic. Compare that with someone in this church who has just celebrated 55 years and is still going by God's grace. Now, what statement does that make to a watching world? A statement that will be all the more clear in the years to come as others continue to tap out of their marriages. 55 years of displaying the goodness and the faithfulness of God and his grace. That's what we've got the opportunity to do, friends, married or not. Let's give ourselves to encouraging and promoting and displaying the beautiful, trustworthy, powerful, gracious, loving faithfulness of our covenant-keeping God. Amen.